Welcome, class, to today's lecture on global supply chain management. We're going to spend about the next half hour walking through a high-level overview of global supply chain management and really getting into a deeper discussion from previous classes around things like capacity. In the last class, we talked a lot about Toyota and the Toyota production system and different models in terms of manufacturing and managing the supply chain. When I talk about global supply chain management, what I'm going to be focusing on in today's lecture is really about understanding demand. Next week, we'll be doing the simulation game that is part of the course packet. But prior to that, I wanted to give us the opportunity to walk through and really understand decisions that need to be made around capacity. From a question perspective, as we look at the lecture, we're going to focus on a number of things. First off is, how do we understand forecasted demand? If I am building the newest iPhone, how do I know how many iPhones to have in the store versus how many ready to be shipped? How much capacity should companies have to cover expected demand for product and services? How much flexibility do you need to have in order to be able to expand? What happens if you have that hot new toy? How do you get more products to the market to ensure that demand is met? And how much reserve capacity will a firm have in terms of being able to meet and exceed the expectations when there is an overabundance of demand? In dealing with all this, you spend a lot of time developing forecasts, understanding precisely how many units that you'll need and when you'll need them. Whether or not it's cars or coffee or video games, there's going to be lead time required in terms of getting your product out to market. When we are looking at inaccurate forecasts, one of the side effects that you'll see from inaccurate forecasts is unexpected disruptions and damage throughout the supply chain. When you look at something that is not truly in demand, you're going to end up with high inventories, you're going to end up carrying increased costs, and you're going to have to mark down your product. It's one of the discussion points that we covered when looking at the Lego case in terms of them understanding their overabundance of supply and how to make sure that they had the right amount of product in the right amount of stores at the right time. Conversely, when we're looking at forecasts that is too low, you may end up looking at competitive products. I know most of you are die-hard iPhone people, but if you weren't able to get your current iPhone for months on end, you'd probably start looking at Droid devices depending on your preferences. So when you look at those, you may see competitive retailers getting advantages if you are unable to meet the supply they're provided. So if I'm looking at this and I want to do something around defining capacity, what I'm going to be doing related to that is essentially marking the volume of output per unit of time. How much output can I get over a specific period? When I get into different types of capacity, I'm going to be looking at it from a multiple perspective. The capacity from a human resources or human capital perspective. This is critical related to the labor that's required to meet and exceed the needs. The capacity related to your processes and your information technology. How are you going to go about building your product? What IT and support components need to be in place technologically to help you get there. Your facility capacity, for example, if your warehouse can only supply 1,000 units per month and the demand is 3,000, how are you going to meet that from a facilities perspective? And then also how you're going to manage and understand the capacity of both your suppliers and your subcontractors if you're waiting for different important parts to the puzzle that you're building. Now, over the last couple of classes, we spoke at great length around process improvement. And understanding process improvement is key here as well when looking at supply chain management, because it's going to allow us to understand how we can increase capacity by reducing waste and rework and process optimization. The entire discussion around Toyota and the Toyota production system was their means of making sure that they were increasing capacity, that they were reducing waste, and that they went with their zero defect rework model. So if I'm looking at how to manage capacity across the supply chain, if I'm looking to maximize and making sure that I have the right number of Xbox 360s in the stores at Christmas, or the right number of iPhone 6s or 7s, I need to make sure that I am maintaining proper forecasts and really looking at all of the key capacity decisions. The foremost critical ones you're going to want to look at is truly understanding and forecasting properly your future demand. What do you truly expect? And you can do this based off of feedback from existing customers, based off of industry analysts, but how are you trying to and what are you doing in terms of going out and forecasting for future demand? How many units do you expect to sell? Also, in terms of doing this, truly understanding any uncertainty that's in that forecast. What could be a driver from an upside or a downside perspective? Next, truly understanding on and deciding on the amount and type of capacity that you wish to provide, as well as the timing of that capacity. Will you leverage multiple vendors? Will you start production of different components at different times to manage this property to lower costs? When you step through the simulation game next week, you're going to see those types of decisions. You're going to be picking which vendor is providing product A and product B, and when you want them to start the cycle of getting their capacity up and understanding all the pitfalls that come with that. So when I talk to customers in terms of their capacity strategy, I ask a number of questions. I categorize them across demand, capability, and capacity plan. When I'm looking at demand, I look at what specifically around your product or features are you including in the forecast? What is the big demand piece you're going to be looking at? What are you driving towards? So from that perspective, a demand assessment would be, I'll use the iPhone again as a new example for when the iPhone 7 comes out. What's going to be that new feature that's going to drive people to want that device? What do you expect from that demand then? The amount of units you would need to provide upfront to make sure that demand is being met. What is the most likely scenario or forecast for that? Apple's done a good job more recently because they've been able to use previous phone releases as a test case. But those of you who remember when the iPad came out and some of their other devices where they were unprepared, they had not done a proper demand assessment, and they were not ready, and they were out of stock for significant periods of time. And a lot of that because they also did not look at capability assessment in terms of what external capacity that they had and when it would be available and how flexible is that capacity. They were getting units shipped from China, they were getting unit ships from around the world where the lead time to get a new unit into a consumer's hand was lengthy. So when you're talking to a manufacturing company or anyone that's really digging into the details of global supply chain, understanding your demand and your capability to add or limit capacity is critical, and understanding and having a true capacity plan. What are you going to do to be able to see your demand scenarios? What are your demand scenarios? What is the financial impact you're going to have in terms of adding or shifting capacity, in terms of making more or making less units? Because the one thing you also don't want to have is thousands of phones that never get used. What happens when you overproduce? What happens when you underproduce? When looking at developing the strategy, a key that you're going to want to do is really truly focus on that demand forecast. Understand what you need and when you're going to need it, but at the same time determining how you are going to expand and contract. What happens if you've got a very popular product and you need significantly more units? And what happens if you completely overestimated the need, Can you slow down production for additional units? And what are the implications for each of those approaches? And what is your implementation plan in terms of rolling out increase or decrease in capacity? And how are you going to about implementing, assessing, and measuring your results? So let's say if you are looking at scaling back capacity, one of the areas where you're going to need to focus some time on is the concept of postponement. So if I'm looking at postponing production until I see more of what the demand truly would be, or staggering production, it allows you to essentially attack the variability of demand and supply and makes it really increasing a reactive capacity versus speculative. So in some areas, you're going to be spending more money because you're going to be waiting to put more products out on the market. But at the same time, you're not going to have an overabundance of capacity because you started building too early without enough information. It's really all about the leverage that you're going to have. So I'm on planes a lot, so I thought this was a great way to kind of explain it. Consider what a pilot needs to do when turning a plane. You are essentially steering the aircraft through a system on the wings and the rudder. When you look at the aircraft in the overall, those specific parts are very small, but the leverage that you use on those turn a much larger aircraft. When we're looking at it from a supply chain perspective, having the right amount of leverage within different components of your supply chain allows you increased maneuverability, from an adding capacity, from a limiting capacity, from ensuring that you're getting proper results from point A to point B. So if I look at supply chain, what I didn't do was really define what I'm talking about. So when I'm talking about supply chain, I'm really talking about linkages of discrete, interdependent entities that collectively transform raw materials into finished products. How am I connecting the dots? How am I getting from point A to point B? What am I doing to connect the functions of an inbound activity with outbound activities? How am I getting from purchase to delivery? Now, if I were going to look at a formal definition, and this one I'm going to read, and I know you're all seeing it on your screen, but if I'm looking at a formal definition, a supply chain is a network of facilities and activities that perform the functions of product development, procurement of materials from suppliers, the movement of materials between facilities, the manufacturing of products, the distribution of finished goods to customers, and aftermarket support for sustainment. Essentially, point A to point B. So if I look at it from a truly high-level perspective, how much time do I have? How am I managing my network of suppliers around the world in terms of where I need to get my product and services from point A to point B until my product is in the hands of my customer? How do I take it from being built to being bought to being delivered to being used? And what are the different steps along the way? I look at the different countries that I spend a lot of time in the Nordics. I'm in Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands all the time. And they purchase a lot of goods and services from around the globe. And how does, for example, GM make sure that they're providing the cars that they need to Finland? What does Ford do in terms of leading and maintaining their mark and their brand across different countries around the globe? How do they get their cars that are being built in different facilities worldwide to users and drivers globally? So if I look at Ford does a number of things in terms of where they are building their cars within Europe. They don't just build their cars in the US. So for Ford, they get different components, and this is key to understand. They get different components from their cars from around the world. From Belfast, they're getting their carburetors. From Wolfirth, they're getting their engine parts. From Cologne, they're getting their transaxle casings. From Bordeaux, they're getting the transmissions. Now, they're going to need each of these individual parts, and they're going to need to get them all to Valencia in Spain for the assembly of the car and managing that supply chain so they're getting the right amount of spark plug-in insulators from Treforest as well as the right amount of carburetors from Belfast so that they can meet the demand for getting the car to users throughout the globe is critical. So you have to have truly at a high level what is your sourcing strategy for global delivery. If Ford tried to build all of their cars in Detroit and send them out into Europe, they would not be able to quickly meet the demands of European customers, and they'd be dealing with additional travel costs. Focusing on the final assembly in Valencia, Spain, and getting the supplies from other parts of that Europe has helped Ford in terms of really manage their supply and distribution change. So when I look at international sourcing strategy, and again, getting into a discussion around international supply chain management, you really have to look at this for such larger customers like a Hyundai, like a Ford. So my Ford or GM sourcing group, they're going to do both outsourcing and intra-firm sourcing. What I mean by that, it's going to be what are you doing in-house versus what items you're getting from independent suppliers. And for Ford, for example, they're going to have under their intra-firm sourcing both domestic and international sourcing and suppliers. Same thing from an outsourcing perspective. You're going to be dealing with domestic purchasing agreements and offshore outsourcing because you're going to need major components in-house by procuring them domestically for different units. You're going to need to have the ability to leverage independent suppliers, and as well as be able to look at everything from both a domestic and a global perspective. So if I'm looking at an international supply chain organization, such as a large global automotive, it's going to be truly reliant on intra-firm cooperation that uses resources from international participants to accomplish shared and independent goals of its members. I have a meeting in 2 weeks with Honda. There's going to be 26 different people on the call from around the globe that are looking truly at how to meet the needs globally across North American Honda, across Honda UK. How are they essentially connecting the dots between what they are doing from a U.S. domestic perspective to a Europe strategy to an Asia Pacific strategy, and looking at different ways to connect everything from resources to users to activities. So if I'm looking at this from an overall competitive advantage perspective, I look at 4 different factors and functions. First being the overall strategy for the organization, which is going to be the conditions for the nation that is essentially organizing and managing the product. So if I'm looking at this from a Ford perspective, it's going to be here's how Ford from a global perspective responds, and here's how it looks at it domestically. What the overall demand conditions are for each of those regions. So what is the demand for Ford in the U.S.? What are the related and supporting industries that are required? Again, looking at something like Ford and the suppliers that are required for automotive and what types of companies could be in play in areas like the Detroit suburbs. And then what are the different positions of production related to workforce? Are there the right workers where the factories are going to be? You've seen that in the U.S. You've seen a move towards the South because of the lack of talent in the Detroit area from the automotive companies, where they've essentially looked for the different skilled labor and infrastructure to meet the needs. Because if you're looking at having this, you need to make sure that you are able to internationally be competitive. It's why you'll see a lot of automotive in Spain, in Mexico, in areas where you can get somewhat cheaper labor, but also still have a skilled workforce and skilled labor to be able to successfully deliver the product and services. So most of you have discussed the value chain at different parts of your business career. Some of you will probably remember it from undergraduate discussions. Others have been discussing it in other grad level classes. Essentially brought forth by Michael Porter, it really is looking at the systematic means of displaying and categorizing the activities. So when we're talking supply chain, you really truly need to remember what was discussed around Porter's value chain, because you're going to see everything from soup to nuts, cradle to grave, order to delivery, what value is added to the product service at each level. Where you're looking at from a value perspective, both the primary activities and the support activities. And when I say support activities, I'm talking about things like human resources, technology, procurement, and IT, because the primary activities are always going to be service, marketing, logistics, operations, and the support activities and the primary activities are both going to help you drive margin. So going in a little bit more detail around the primary activities, I'm going to read this one because I think it's key. Primary activities are the 5 basic functions needed to physically produce a product or service, deliver and market it to buyers, and support it after the sale. Now, each of these is going to add value. When I'm talking about inbound logistics, I'm truly talking about what part of the product can begin or before service can be performed when we're dealing about the materials being handled, where they're going to be stored, how many warehouses you're going to have, what you're going to use from an inventory control system, how are you going to work on getting products to and from suppliers. And when I'm looking at it from an outbound logistics perspective, how am I going to distribute my product? How am I going to deliver my product? How am I going to handle the ordering? So when you hear inbound logistics, it's really around what am I going to do with my parts and pieces to get this pulled together. When it's outbound logistics, it's going to be really what am I going to do to be able to push these properly out to my customers. When I get into the support activities, it's really truly around the different factors within the value chain that are going to allow you to get from point A to point B. I'm going to need support from procurement in terms of getting the goods and services required to put my product together. I'm going to need human resources in terms of having the staff. I'm going to need technology in terms of being able to support all of these different activities. Because when I look at it together, it's all tied. It's all tied together, and it allows you in a step-by-step basis to really understand what a global supply chain strategy looks like across the value chain. For the first step, you're going to need to understand what links you can separate. Can you do R&D? You're going to be looking at essentially siloing or putting into different work streams your R&D, your manufacturing, your marketing. These are areas where you can focus and then merge back together later. The second step you're going to really look at is really look at where these items are going to occur. Where does it make sense to have your marketing department run out of? Do you want to do your marketing department globally out of the US? Do you want to have your marketing department run regionally from country to country? Is manufacturing going to be globally based out of one location or distributed across the world? I use a great example when talking about this a lot related to Guinness. Guinness made the effort to put a brewery in the U.S. to help from a shipping time over to the States. But when people drank the Guinness that was brewed in the States, they didn't like it because it tasted different than the Guinness that was brewed in Ireland, even though it was essentially brewed the same exact way. So understanding where you're going to do your product development, understanding your global advantage in terms of where you're going to look at economies of scale and scope, understanding the where. And then looking at, from a step 3 perspective, understanding the level of transaction costs. What is it going to cost you to monitor everything? What is it going to cost you to negotiate employee contracts? And what is going to give you the lowest cost mode to get the most value? Next, you're then going to be looking at what are the comparative advantages of different countries. What am I doing in terms of why do something in Mexico versus in the U.S.? How is it relevant to my value chain? And finally, understanding and making sure you have enough flexibility in decision making from an organizational perspective to ensure that you can both think globally and act locally. So if I'm looking at this, I need to have strong positioning, strong integration, I need to be agile, and I need to have measurement. From a positioning perspective, I need to ensure that I have a sound structural approach from a global operations perspective. I need to know from an integration perspective who is doing what and how they're doing it and how creative they are to deliver the needs across the globe. I need to be agile in terms of the retention of my competitiveness as well as my staff to ensure customer success. And then from a measurement perspective, I truly need to look at what is the cost and how am I going to monitor my global operations. Because when I look at it at a high level, I'm going to be managing cost, I'm going to be managing taxes, I'm going to be managing labor rates. I need to understand what it's going to cost for me to have my staff in Nicaragua. I need to understand what freight tariffs I'm going to have to deal with when shipping into Norway. I'm going to need to understand currency exchange rates between the US dollar and the Danish kroner. I'm going to need to understand customs related to any duties in terms of shipping across country lines. I need to understand what the changes over time are going to do related to commodities and level of assembly. Because I need to know what my export regulations are going to be. I need to know how much time I'm going to need. If I'm building a product in China and shipping it to the US, what is it going to take to get from point A to point B? We're going to have an interesting dialogue in class around Walmart and how they get their t-shirts that are being made in China onto the shelves and still only manage to charge $5. What have they done to manage lead time? What have they done to manage transit time? How are they getting their products through customs? And what are the taxes and local information that needs to be thought of? So if I'm looking at this from a high level perspective, I ask several questions when we get related to manufacturing. If I'm looking at building a new car to serve Europe, how many plants do I need for that? Where should these factories be? Should I centrally locate? Should I be looking at low cost of resources? Should I be looking at where I'm closer to my suppliers? Which products should each facility make? Which technologies are needed? And what part of the world would each plant serve? Does the cars made in the U.S. only sell it within North America, or are you going to ship cars made in the U.S. to other parts of the world? You then need to understand your supply base and your vendors. What are you doing from a vendor selection? How are you making sure that you've got the right suppliers and that you are again thinking capacity? Don't From the early part of this lecture, understanding capacity is going to impact how you are doing your vendor selection. And what of this do you want to keep in-house? What is your outsourcing plan? How much of this work can you do in-house? How much are you going to build on your own? How much are you going to push out? You look at Apple, for example, doesn't make the screens that they use for their phones. And if that's the case, what are the costs from the vendor that's providing the screens? In terms of, is it going to be variable? Are they going to be able to meet your demands? Do they have the capacity that's needed? Now, when I get into some of the different global perspectives, what are we looking at from a tax perspective? Some countries it doesn't make sense to build products in. Denmark is one of the higher taxed income for employees, but has very flexible taxes for organizations. So you may be getting good rates from a corporate tax perspective, but your employees are going to be higher paid because of the tax component. And then you look at, where do you get your spare parts from? How are you going to manage this globally if all the parts you have are coming from Spain, but you're trying to do product development and delivery in the UK or in France? So I'll sit down and I'll walk through and try to understand a product pipeline. And how am I getting from soup to nuts from point A to point B? And these next slides or two are going to be helpful for you when you're doing the simulation game in terms of, when do I need more than one supplier? Do I want to source from one vendor or two? So if I look at parts related to doing an auto part for within Japan, I'm dealing with automakers, I'm dealing with wholesalers, I'm dealing with dealers, I'm dealing with sales companies, I'm dealing with wholesalers, And all of these are going to be different areas where you can get the auto parts. And as you can tell just from looking at it, it boggles your mind a little bit when you look at all the different means of getting parts and services, and where you're getting them and what the cost is going to be and how quickly you can provide parts to those organizations. And then when you look at it from an auto part perspective in excuse me, in the US, you can look at it from really multiple different angles. How you're getting things from the manufacturer out to the customer. In some areas, if it's going just to the dealership, you're going from the warehouse to the jobber group to the installer. So it's basically going from being built to the dealership to the user. Or in other situations, if the user's doing it themselves, it's going out to a mass merchandiser like a AutoZone, or a repair specialist like Jiffy Lube. So if I were going to look at a large computer company, I'm going to say Dell or IBM or Compaq or any other large computer supplier. What are they doing in terms of building their computers to ensure that they're getting a good return on investment, as well as simplifying their supply chain? So if I'm looking at and using an example, something like a Dell, if I want to redesign their supply chain, I need to both look at where their plants currently are and where they should be located. I need to understand the process technologies that should be at each plant. I need to specify the loading on each plant and the services area. So and I've tried to map this out so it's not too specific, but looking at one of the computer suppliers, before their reorganization, they were across the globe in terms of where they were getting different pieces and parts from. And some areas they got chips, some areas they got their box systems, some areas they got different components and files, and they really wanted to look at redesigning it so they could get items out quicker. They wanted to reduce the number of facilities, they wanted to reduce the number of plants, and they wanted to be more regionally focused. And in doing that, they managed to reduce their manufacturing and logistics costs by $375 million and achieve higher customer satisfaction. So if you look at this slide, you see a lot less providers, but you see that they're all clumped together. So in North America, chips and modules and boxes are grouped together. In Europe, they've done the same thing. In Asia Pac, they went with a regional approach. So I want you to think about this and probably listen to this deck again as you prepare for the discussion on Tuesday. On Tuesday, we're going to be spending time talking about Walmart and how they do some of their global supply chain management to help get products from point A to point B. And what are the different processes that can be improved. The goal with this in the end is to understand not only the hows and the whys, but the decisions that need to get made in order to successfully lead a global organization and understanding everything from soup to nuts. And this marks the end of today's lecture. Thank you.